In the early morning hours of November 19th, 1972, Danny Whitten's body was found. He was 29 years old. Official report: accidental death, a lethal combination of alcohol and Valium. But this accident had been orchestrated just hours before. It didn't start with a needle. It started with a cruel act, a dismissal, a one-way plane ticket, and $50 in cash. Danny Whitten didn't use the plane ticket. He used money. His death wasn't an accident. It was a tragic choice, financed by the friend who was trying to save him. The story of Danny Whitten, more than anything, is a story about the search for an effective painkiller. The tragedy is that he found one, and it worked for a time, and then it demanded payment. He was born Daniel Ray Whitten on May 8, 1943 in Columbus, Georgia. This date is a strange cosmic secret he would one day share. His future bandmate, his musical brother and crazy horse, Billy Talbot, would be born in the exact same year. It was a detail they would later hide, superstitious perhaps of what it meant, as if the universe had tethered them together. But in 1943, there was no cosmic destiny. There was only survival. Columbus, Georgia, in the 1940s, was a city of harsh, unyielding realities. It was a textile town, a military town, a place defined by the long dark shadow of the Great Depression and the all-consuming industrial maw of World War II. This was the hard-scrabble, working-class, segregated South. Danny Whitten was born on the wrong side of that divide. He was the second of 4 children, brought into a family that was, to put it plainly, poor, deeply, grindingly poor. His father was a man who worked with his hands, a laborer in a life of long hours, little pay, and even less dignity. His mother was a homemaker, the anchor of the family, but an anchor being dragged down by the sheer weight of circumstance. This home, this family, was not a sanctuary, it was a tinderbox. The pressure of poverty, the suffocating strain of too many mouths to feed, found its release in the only way it knew how. In violence, young Danny's first and most formative education was not in a schoolhouse. His first memories were not of nursery rhymes, but of the sound of his parents fighting. We must be clear about what this means. This was the terrifying, percussive, explosive sound of 2 people trapped in a cage of poverty, tearing at each other. The screaming matches, the sound of doors slamming, of things breaking. This was Danny Whitten's childhood soundtrack. This was the first sound he learned. It was raw. It was distorted. It was terrifyingly loud. For a child, this kind of instability is world-defining. It teaches you that nothing is safe, that love is loud, and that the only true peace is silence, which is just the pause before the next explosion. It teaches you to make yourself small, to become invisible, to be a reliable presence that never ever causes a problem. It creates a wound, a deep psychological foundational wound. In the early 1950s, when Danny was somewhere between the ages of 7 and 10, the fault line that ran beneath his family finally, irrevocably split. His parents divorced. The family, already fragile, shattered. His mother, now a single woman with 4 children in the deeply conservative 1950s South, was adrift, and so began the migration. Their desperate post-war shuffling did not lead them to the golden mythical promised land of California. Instead, his mother remarried, and the new family moved north, chasing the promise of industrial work. They landed in Canton, Ohio. This was not a rescue. This was a different kind of chaos. Canton in the 1950s was not the sun-drenched dream of the West Coast. This was the Rust Belt. It was a world of steel mills, factories, and hard gray winters. It was a landscape of cramped working-class houses and the constant grinding noise of a city built on practical jobs. For Danny, this was a new isolation. He was a misfit, a kid with a thick Georgia accent dropped into a tough northern industrial town. He was a poor kid from the South in a world that valued one thing above all: hard, physical labor. Survival. The family was crammed into a small house. The walls were just as thin as they had been in Georgia, and the struggles just as loud. This experience, this foundation of poverty, displacement, and emotional chaos, did two critical things to the young boy. First, it instilled in him a desperate, profound, all-consuming need. To escape, he needed a way out, a secret language that could drown out the noise of his family and the factories. Second, it planted a deep, insidious, and permanent seed of self-doubt. When you grow up being told implicitly or explicitly that you are not worth much, that message sticks. It becomes the voice in the back of your head. It creates a wound of inadequacy. And Danny Whitten would spend the rest of his short, tragic life trying to fill that wound. Then, the final piece of this tragic architecture was put in place. His mother's new husband, his stepfather, entered the home. This new stepfather was, by all accounts, abusive for Danny. This was not just a new father figure. This was a new antagonist. This was the chaos of his childhood, which had once been an ambient terror, now given a face, a name, and a singular focused presence in his home. We don't know the specifics of the abuse. The psychological footprint is what matters. The daily tension, the feeling of being an unwelcome, powerless presence in his own home. This was the crucible, a boiling pot of poverty, instability, anxiety, and abuse. It was in this crucible, in this small, suffocating house in Canton, Ohio, that Danny Whitten found his weapon, his shield, his escape. He found the guitar. It's not hard to imagine why. In a house ruled by an abusive stepfather, where his voice was the last one anyone wanted to hear, in a house where he had no power, no agency, no control, the guitar was a voice. It was his. He wasn't a prodigy. We must be clear on this. He was not a Steve Winwood, a boy genius. Danny Whitten was an obsessive. He was a worker. He would lock himself away, a quiet, brooding kid with a cheap guitar and just play. He was, by all accounts, entirely self-taught. And what do you think he was playing? He was not playing polite, clean, major key melodies. He was playing the sounds he knew. He was playing the chaos. When he got his hands on a small, cheap amplifier and he cranked that volume knob all the way to the right, until the small speaker cone couldn't handle the signal, until it buzzed and tore and broke apart, that wasn't a mistake. That was the sound of his parents fighting. That was the sound of his stepfather's rage. That was the sound of the steel mills grinding outside his window. That was the sound of his entire life. A life of instability and distortion and raw, frayed nerve energy. That raw, fuzzy, distorted tone that would one day define his sound. That was not a stylistic choice. That was a confession. That was his trauma, externalized, amplified, and given a new name. It was the blues. Not the blues of the Mississippi Delta. It was the blues of the post-war, white, urban, traumatized migrant. It was the sound of his specific individual pain, and his family did not understand. His father and now his stepfather were men of survival. They were men of practical jobs. They saw the world in black and white. You work, you eat, you sleep, you die. This noise, this obsession with a wooden box, it was a waste of time. It was a fantasy. They preached survival. They pushed him toward the factories, toward hard labor, the very life he was using the guitar to escape. This was the central defining internal conflict of his entire existence, survival versus ambition. His mother, meanwhile, was supportive, but her support was just another unstable element. She was the one who, in his mind, had failed to protect him. Her support was likely as inconsistent as her life, a fragile thing that he couldn't and wouldn't rely on. This created a terrible psychic split. On one hand, he developed a deep, burning resentment for these family pressures, for the practical job world, for the survival mindset that he saw as a trap. But on the other hand, something far more complex and far more tragic was happening. In response to the chaos, in response to the unreliable adults around him, he began to forge a new personality. He became, as a trauma response, the reliable one. He became the anchor. He became the quiet kid who never caused a problem. He would be dependable. He would be solid. He would be the bandmate who always showed up, who always knew the parts. This desire to be the reliable bandmate, this image he would project for the rest of his life, wasn't a personality trait. It was a symptom. It was the psychological armor he built to protect himself. And it was this very armor that would one day lead him to hide his addiction, to refuse therapy, and to smile and nod and say, "I'm fine," right up until the moment it killed him. While this internal war was raging, his external life was beginning to take shape. He was a teenager in the 1950s Ohio. He was listening to the radio. He was hearing the birth of rock and roll. He was hearing Chuck Berry's defiant poetry. He was hearing Elvis's borrowed supercharged swagger. He felt like a misfit. He was a kid with southern roots living in a northern industrial town, in love with a new hybrid music that the survival world saw as the devil's music. This feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging anywhere, it only deepened his isolation. He started playing. He was in school bands, playing local jazz, but his heart was in the raw, R&B inflected rock he was hearing. By the late 1950s, he was a teenager playing gigs, honing his craft, building his armor. He earned the nickname Danny, a name that stuck, a name that felt simpler, tougher. But there were no major contracts. There was no knock on the door from a big-shot producer. He was still the kid from the small Ohio house. He was still staring at the soul-crushing future of a factory job. These early failures, this garage anonymity, were devastating. They fed the self-doubt that had been planted in him since birth. They fed the voice of his stepfather, the voice that said, "You're nothing. This is a fantasy. Get a real job." He was desperate to be a front man, to lead his own band, to create his own family, a reliable family one that he could be the anchor for. And inside, the wound was festering. The isolation, the competition with his siblings, the constant low-level hum of anxiety, it was all building. Something dark began to emerge in his teenage years. Schizophrenia-like symptoms, crippling, paralyzing anxiety. These were cries for help from a psyche that was under a relentless 15-year siege. And in a world that only valued survival, in a family that had no language for mental health, these cries were completely, utterly, and tragically ignored. The stage was set. Danny Whitten was a young man armed with a profound, raw, and untutored talent. He was also a man carrying a profound, untreated, and gaping wound. All he needed, all he was desperately searching for, was a painkiller. In 1960, Danny Whitten was 17 years old, and he made his choice. He turned his back on the survival world that had suffocated him. He chose ambition. He dropped out of high school. This was not a simple act of teenage rebellion. This was a declaration of independence. This was him, a 17-year-old boy, looking at the entire survival architecture of his life in Ohio and walking out the front door. From that moment on, he was a full-time professional musician. He was now untethered. He and his friend Billy Talbot made the migration his family never had. They went to the golden, mythical promised land, Los Angeles. The scene in Los Angeles in the very early 1960s was a world in flux. The Sunset Strip was the epicenter of this change. It was a chaotic, competitive, and thrilling university for a young musician. Danny Whitten dived in. He was a man in search of a new family. He started playing in a string of local garage bands like the Electras. This was his apprenticeship. This was where he took the raw, distorted, trauma-fueled noise he had perfected in his bedroom and learned to shape it. He was a sponge. He was absorbing the new chiming melodic structures of the Beatles. He was soaking in the arrogant R&B-drenched swagger of the Rolling Stones. And he was blending it all with the Chuck Berry riffs and the deep blues, feeling that he had already made his own. This was still in many ways a survival gig. He was playing for food and rent. But for the first time, it was survival in the service of ambition. Every night he spent on a stage, he was proving his stepfather wrong. He had his brother, Billy Talbot, with him. Talbot was a bass player, the foundational lock to Danny's energy driver key. They were two sides of the same coin, but a brotherhood needs a heartbeat. They found it 2 years later, in 1962. They met a quiet, solid, and powerful drummer named Ralph Molina was the final piece of the puzzle. He was the anchor for both of them. His drumming was simple, powerful, and above all reliable. He had a way of playing just slightly behind the beat, giving the music a deep, heavy, loping groove, a groove that was perfect for Danny's raw, emotional leads. This was the moment. This was the chemical reaction. When the three of them, Danny on guitar, Billy on bass, Ralph on drums, played together for the first time, it wasn't just another garage band. It was a unit. It was a gang. It was a three-headed beast. It was, for Danny Whitten, the first truly reliable thing he had ever been a part of in his entire life. We cannot overstate the psychological importance of this. For Danny, a man who had fled the chaos of a broken, unreliable home, a man whose trauma response was to build an armor of reliability. This was his sanctuary. This was his new family. And in this new family, he was the leader. He was the energy driver. He was the lead guitarist, the primary songwriter, the front man he had always been desperate to be. He was, for the first time, in control. This band wasn't just his ambition, it was his therapy. They needed a name for this new family. And in 1962, they gave it one. They called themselves the Psychedelegates. It was a name of the times, a perfect, clumsy snapshot of the era, psychedi for the new mind-expanding consciousness, and delegates for the formal, suit and tie seriousness. For Danny, perhaps, it sounded official. It sounded reliable. It sounded like a practical job, but on his terms. The Psychedelegates started gigging, and they were good. They were a force. They were covering the Beatles. They were covering the Byrds, but they were filtering it all through their own unique, distorted lens. And that lens was Danny. This was his first true taste of ambition realized. He was a leader. He had his brothers. But this new life came with a whole new set of dangers, and the old wounds were still there, just beneath the armor. The 1960s Hollywood scene was a universe of chemical temptation. In 1961, as the band was just finding its footing, Danny began to experiment. It started, as it so often does, with marijuana. We must understand this in the context of his search for a painkiller. This wasn't just a 17-year-old kid partying. This was a man with a deep, untreated reservoir of anxiety and schizophrenia-like symptoms. This was self-medication. Marijuana was the painkiller he had been searching for. It was a way to calm the constant low-level hum of anxiety. It was a way to silence the inner critic, the voice of his stepfather. It was a tool, And for a time it probably worked. The seed of dependency was planted. And this new life created new volatile conflicts. The first was with his old family. His mother, the woman he still sought approval from, was terrified. She saw this new life, the late nights, the long hair, the rumors of drugs, and she saw unstable. Danny, in turn, rebelled against her fears. Her concern in his traumatized mind wasn't love. It was just another voice telling him to give up. It was the survival mindset trying to pull him back into the cage. The second conflict was external. The Psychedelics were a great local band, but that's all they were. There was no record label. The financial struggle was brutal. And here is the most suffocating, most humiliating irony. He was a band leader on the Sunset Strip at night. He was the energy driver, the front man, the avatar of ambition. But by day, he was taking construction jobs just like his father. He had run as far and as hard as he could, only to end up right back where he started, in the survival world, doing practical jobs, a hammer in his hand instead of a guitar. Can you imagine the self-loathing? Every day he spent on a construction site was a victory for his stepfather. Every dollar he earned that way was a validation of the survival world he so despised. This garage anonymity wasn't just a career frustration. It was a psychic crisis. This frustration created tension within his new family. He, Billy, and Ralph began to argue about their direction. This was the first conflict in his new, reliable family. And there was another darker shadow. The painkiller that he had embraced was starting to show its teeth. The drug culture of the Strip wasn't just peace and love. It was dark, and Danny was witnessing the real consequences. He was seeing friends overdose. This triggered a profound, crushing guilt. This is the tragic, tangled psychological knot of Danny Whitten. He himself was drowning in anxiety and turning to substances to survive. How could he possibly save anyone else? This guilt just became another log on the fire of his anxiety. He was trapped, and he was hiding it. The 2024 McDonough biography reveals the secret he was keeping. He was keeping a private diary, and in that diary, he wasn't the energy driver. He was the kid from the duplex. He confessed his deep, private, paralyzing fear of being a failure. He was terrified that his unstable life would prove his family right. By 1967, the Psychedelics were a unit, a brotherhood, but they were a family going nowhere, stuck in garage anonymity. The name felt clumsy. The frustration demanded a change. They evolved. They added another guitarist, George Whitzel, and a keyboardist. They renamed themselves the Rockets. It was a name that was pure, primal Americana. It was a name that had dirt under its fingernails. This was not a band of delegates. This was a war party, but a new name doesn't magically create a new reality. In 1968, they managed to cut their self-titled debut album for White Whale Records. This should have been the moment ambition won. This should have been the vindication. The album landed with a thud. It was a commercial failure. It was a footnote. For Danny, this was a disaster. It was a confirmation of his deepest fear. He was a failure. He had led his new family into a commercial dead end. The gatekeepers had judged them as not good enough. The self-doubt that had been planted in him since Georgia was ripped open. The survival voice, the one that sounded like his stepfather, was no doubt screaming in his head, "I told you so, this is a fantasy." The pressure was immense. The anxiety, the schizophrenia-like symptoms were now amplified by a very real, very public failure. He was in more pain than ever before, and he needed a better painkiller. Marijuana wasn't cutting it. It could calm the nerves, but it couldn't silence the voice. And so, Around 1965, in the dark, desperate corners of the Los Angeles scene, Danny Whitten experimented with heroin. We must be absolutely clear about what this was. This was not a party drug. This was not a kid looking for a good time. This was a man in profound, untreated psychological pain, finally finding what he thought was the cure. And for Danny Whitten, the first time that needle went in, it must have felt like a revelation. It was not a high, it was a release. For the first time in his 22 years of life, the noise stopped, the screaming of his parents, the rage of his stepfather, the buzz of his own crippling anxiety, the mocking voice of his failure. It all just stopped. It was replaced by a warm, quiet, beautiful, unambiguous silence. Heroin was an emotional painkiller. It was, in a tragic and twisted irony, the one truly reliable thing he had ever found. It was a promise. Take me, and the pain will go away every single time. This, perhaps, is what gave him a creative edge. It wasn't that the drug made him creative. It was that the drug silenced his inner critic. It anesthetized the self-doubt. It allowed his raw ambition to flow without the survival mindset, screaming that he wasn't good enough. But this magic, this painkiller, had a price. It also planted a chillingly precise seed of paranoia. His untreated anxiety, those schizophrenia-like symptoms, were just being masked. As the drug's effect wore off, they would return, but worse. This was the state of Danny Whitten, a man in a state of profound secret contradiction. By day, a failure, a construction worker, a man consumed by anxiety. By night, a creative genius, a local legend, floating on a chemical cloud. He was a king in a garage, but a king who was now a slave to his new medicine. And then in 1967, something did change. A new gatekeeper arrived in town, a loner, a star who was, in his own way, just as much of a misfit as Danny was. He met Neil Young. This was the moment fate intervened, the moment the ambition plot and the painkiller plot fused into a single tragic narrative. The connection was through the Los Angeles scene. Neil Young was coming off the dissolution of his critically acclaimed band, Buffalo Springfield. He was a star. He had a record deal. He had access. Danny Whitten was a local. This sparked an immediate, brilliant tension in Danny. Admiration, but also a subtle jealousy. Of course it did. Here was a guy, a songwriter of breathtaking talent, who had made it. For Danny, Neil Young was a walking, talking, misfit mirror of everything he wasn't. But then they played. Neil Young, the meticulous, introspective songwriter, had recorded his first solo album and hated it. He hated the slick, polished session musicians. He was a loner who wrote folk songs, but he had the heart of a rocker. He was looking for raw. He was looking for feel. He was looking for pain. He was looking for the sound of Danny Whitten's guitar. Someone in the LA grapevine told him, "You want raw? You need to go see this band, the Rockets." So Neil Young, the star, goes to some dark, sweaty club on the Strip to audition this local band. And the moment the Rockets plug in, the moment that thundering, loping, perfectly imperfect groove of Ralph and Billy kicks in, the moment Danny Whitten hits the first distorted, fuzzy, raw chord on his guitar for Neil Young, it must have been the same kind of revelation that heroin had been for Danny. It was the sound. It was the raw energy he had been searching for. It was a band that didn't just play his songs, they bled them. And in Danny Whitten, Neil Young found his perfect foil. It was the poet meeting the voice. Only this time, the voice was a 1950s Gretsch guitar, played by a man channeling a lifetime of trauma. Neil Young, the meticulous order of the songwriter, had found his perfect chaos in Danny Whitten's sound. And Neil Young, a man of creative control, needed to control that chaos. In 1968, the partnership was formalized. Neil Young officially hired the Rockets, Danny, Billy, and Ralph, to be his backing band for his second album, and he gave them a new name. He called them Crazy Horse. The album that would become Everybody Knows This is Nowhere. This was it. Ambition had not just knocked on the door, it had kicked it down. At 25 years old, Danny Whitten was no longer a local hero. He was the lead guitarist and vocal foil for a star. And it was, without question, the worst thing that could have possibly happened to him. Because what does that kind of success do to a man who is secretly, silently being consumed by an addiction? It doesn't cure the addiction, it feeds it. And what does that kind of pressure, the pressure to deliver, to be the raw energy every single night, to be the reliable partner to a genius, do to a man with a deep, untreated anxiety disorder? It terrifies him. And how does that man, Danny Whitten, deal with that terror? He turns to his painkiller. By 1968, the tragic, inevitable conclusion was clear. His addiction escalated to heavy heroin use, and his paranoia now included hearing voices. This was the pivot. The experimentation was now a full-blown, heavy daily dependency. The success, the access, the pressure, it all just became fuel for the fire. The paranoia that had been a seed was now a forest. His anxiety was becoming unmanageable. This is the schizophrenia-like symptom from his childhood. His untreated mental illness, now in a full-blown, terrifying chemical storm. He was, quite literally, losing his mind. He was losing his grip. And as his grip on reality began to slip, oh, did his grip on his guitar. The result was, again, precise. His addiction caused him to miss gigs. This is the ultimate heartbreaking psychological tragedy of Danny Whitten, the man whose entire identity, whose entire armor was built on being the reliable bandmate, the man who had fled the unreliable chaos of his childhood. He was now becoming the unreliable one. He would be late, he would be high, he would be sick. The painkiller he took to survive and achieve his ambition was now actively destroying the foundation of his identity. It was destroying his reliability. This psychological break, this self-betrayal must have been a living hell, a hell of guilt and shame and self-loathing, which of course only made him need the painkiller more. It was a perfect closed fatal loop. And this created the core, unresolvable conflict with the one man who held his ambition in his hands, Neil Young. Neil Young is, and always has been, a man of control, meticulous, creative, and total control. Danny Whitten was, by 1968, a man of chaos. The very raw energy that Young had wanted to use was now consuming the man himself. The stage was set for the greatest, most important music of Danny Whitten's life, and it was set for his death. The recording sessions for Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere were not just a new beginning, they were the beginning of the end. The year is 1968. Danny Whitten, Billy Talbot, and Ralph Molina, the war party known as Crazy Horse, have just been anointed. For Danny, this is the culmination of everything, the survival world of his father, the humiliation of the construction site. It was all in the past. The pressure was immediate. Neil Young, fresh from what he felt, was the overproduced, slick failure of his first solo album, wanted the opposite. He wanted raw. He wanted blood. They convened at Wally Heider's new studio in Hollywood in early 1969. This was not a typical recording session. It was an exorcism. Neil Young brought his new songs, strange, sprawling folk rock epics, and he threw them into the cage with the three-headed beast of Crazy Horse, and the beast feasted. The resulting album, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, is not a record. It's a sound. It's the sound of a perfect, dangerous chemical fusion. It's the sound of Neil Young's meticulous order colliding with the chaos of Crazy Horse. And the heart of that chaos, the uranium at the core of the reactor, was Danny Whitten. Let's be very clear about what happened in that studio. While mythology and even some early notes might suggest co-writes on songs like Cowgirl in the Sand, the factual record, which the user has previously corrected, is clearer. Neil Young was the sole songwriter, but that fact is the most misleading truth in rock and roll. Neil Young may have written Down by the River and Cowgirl in the Sand, but his name is not the only one on those songs. Danny Whitten's soul is the ink they're written in. Listen to Down by the River. Listen to that solo. That is not a guitar solo. It is an interrogation. It is not technical. It is brutal. It is one note stabbed over and over and over again with a distorted, fuzzy, raw tone that sounds like a human nerve being exposed to air that is Danny Whitten. That is the noise from his childhood, the sound of his parents fighting. That is the anxiety of the misfit. That is the sound of his trauma, finally focused, finally given a purpose, and broadcast to the world as art. And listen to Cowgirl in the Sand, the way the band, Danny, Billy, and Ralph, lock into that hypnotic, loping two-chord groove. They don't just play the song, they inhabit it. They create a sprawling, dangerous 10-minute landscape for Neil Young's story. And that sound, that raw energy was captured. The album was a sensation. It climbed to number 34 on the U.S. charts, but critically, it was a revolution. Down by the River and Cowgirl in the Sand became staples of the new underground FM rock radio. Danny Whitten had won. He was a star. He was the energy core of the most important new sound in rock music. He had his family. He had his ambition. He had finally defeated the self-doubt, or so it seemed. But here is the central, dark, and fatal irony. The ambition and the painkiller were now inextricably linked. This success, this validation, this pressure, it was terrifying. The misfit kid from the Ohio house was now on the world stage. The self-doubt didn't disappear. It mutated. The voice in his head was no longer saying, "You're a failure." It was now screaming, "You're a fraud, and at any moment they're going to find out." And the paranoia, the schizophrenia-like symptoms that had been a low-level hum, were now by 1969 at their peak. He was convinced of betrayal. He was isolated. His new family, his reliable brothers, were now watching him. He could feel it. He could feel Neil's meticulous, controlling gaze. He could feel Billy and Ralph's concern, their judgment. His paranoia wasn't entirely wrong. They were watching him because the painkiller was no longer a creative edge. It was now heroin heavy. It was no longer a tool he used. It was a master he served. The success of Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere didn't cure his addiction. It financed it. The pressure of that success didn't lessen his anxiety. It demanded a stronger painkiller. He was now, in 1969, trapped in a perfect, closed, fatal loop. The anxiety and paranoia screamed. The painkiller was the only thing that would silence the screaming. The heroin made him unreliable. His unreliability triggered his deepest psychological trauma, the terror of failing his reliable family. This terror, this guilt, this self-loathing made the anxiety and paranoia scream louder, which of course demanded more heroin. This is the state he was in when they went back into the studio in 1970 for the follow-up. This was the period that would produce Neil Young's commercial breakthrough after the Gold Rush. It was another masterpiece. It climbed to number 8 in the U.S. It was a gentler, more acoustic album, but the chaos of Crazy Horse was still there. The essential ingredient, listen to When You Dance, I Can Really Love. Neil Young wrote the song, but the song as we know it is Danny Whitten. That driving, rhythmic, distorted, chugging guitar part is the engine. It's the last great gasp of the reliable, raw energy Danny. He could still, at this point, just barely pull it together. But the cracks were no longer cracks. They were gaping chasms. This was the last great moment of the partnership. Because at the same time, Danny Whitten was trying to do something for himself. He was trying to prove that his ambition was separate from Neil's, that he was not just the chaos to Neil's order. In 1971, Crazy Horse, Danny, Billy, and Ralph, plus some new members, recorded their own album, Loose. This was their statement. This was Danny's statement. And on that album, he laid his soul bare. He wrote and sang a song he had written entirely on his own. It wasn't a distorted, raw garage rock anthem. It was a quiet, desperate, heartbreakingly beautiful ballad. It was called I Don't Want to Talk About It. Let's just pause and absorb the weight of this man. A man drowning in a pain he could not talk about. A man whose entire psychological armor was built to hide the wound. A man whose childhood trauma, whose crippling anxiety, whose voices, whose raging secret addiction were all things he could not articulate. And he wrote these words, I can tell by your eyes that you've probably been crying forever, and the stars in the sky don't mean nothing to you. They're a mirror. I don't want to talk about it, how you broke my heart. If I stay here just a little bit longer, if I stay here, won't you listen to my heart? This was not a love song. This was a suicide note. This was a confession. This was the real Danny Whitten, the kid from the duplex whispering his secret into a microphone. This was his ambition in its purest form. The album Loose was released in 1971. It was a catastrophic commercial flop. The world, the gatekeepers, the public, they didn't want the real Danny Whitten. They didn't want his pain. They wanted his raw energy. They wanted his chaos in service of Neil Young's order. This failure, it's impossible to overstate what this must have done to him. It was the ultimate, final rejection. It was the gatekeepers of the entire world looking at his soul, his heart, his purest ambition, and saying, no, thanks. It was the voice of his stepfather, now amplified to the size of the planet, saying, you're a failure. It was all a fantasy. Get a practical job. This rejection was the point of no return. The self-doubt had won. The failure complex was now a proven fact. The pain was no longer manageable, and the painkiller became his entire reality. He was now, by 1971, a full-blown, non-functioning addict. Neil Young was watching his friend, his musical brother, his raw energy disintegrate. And Neil, a man of action, was filled with a potent mixture of rage, pity, and guilt. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He wrote a song about it. He wrote The Needle and the Damage Done. He was performing it live in 1971, a full year before Danny died. I hit the city and I lost my band. I watched the needle take another man, gone, the damage done. This was not a tribute. This was a public indictment. This was an intervention, a plea, and an angry, mournful eulogy all at once. Imagine the paranoia of the man, already convinced the world was conspiring against him, now hearing his brother, his gatekeeper, Neil Young, singing about his secret, his shame, his sickness, on stages all across the world. This must have been the final betrayal. The reliable family wasn't just watching him, they were exposing him. The psychological knot was now a noose. And then, in late 1972, Neil Young, fresh off the massive career-defining success of his album Harvest, decided to go on tour. This was the big one. This wasn't a club tour. This was an arena tour. And Neil, despite everything, wanted his band. He wanted the sound, he wanted Crazy Horse. He wanted one last time to see if the reliable bandmate was still in there. He called rehearsals. This was it. This was Danny Whitten's last chance. This was the moment for ambition to have one last fight against the painkiller. Danny Whitten showed up. We have to imagine this scene, Neil Young, the meticulous, focused order of the superstar at his absolute peak. And Danny Whitten, the chaos, the ghost, the misfit kid walking in. He was a wreck. He was a shell. He was shaking. He was high. He was sick. He couldn't remember the parts. He couldn't feel the rhythm. The raw energy that Neil had fallen in love with, the voice of that distorted Gretsch guitar was gone. It had been silenced, finally and completely, by the painkiller. The man whose entire identity was built on being the reliable anchor, the energy core, was now nothing. He was a void. He was a liability. He had become the one thing he had spent his entire life running from, an unreliable, unstable problem. Neil Young, the man of order, the man who was about to launch the biggest tour of his life, looked at the ghost of his friend, and he made the only decision he could. He fired him. He fired his friend. He broke up the family. He exiled his brother. This is the scene. This is the brutal, heartbreaking climax of the tragedy Neil Young, filled with a bottomless, complex, and agonizing mixture of rage, pity, professional necessity, and guilt, sits Danny Whitten down. He tells him it's over. He tells him he can't come on the tour. He tells him he's unreliable. He hands him $50, and he hands him a plane ticket back to Los Angeles. He tells him to go get help, to go to rehab, to get himself together. But Danny Whitten didn't hear that. He just heard the rejection. He just saw the money, $50, the price of his failure, the final insulting practical job paycheck, the survival world in the form of his greatest ambition, giving him his severance. It was, as Neil Young would say for the rest of his life, the blow that killed him. It wasn't a bullet. It was just the final crushing validation of every negative voice, every piece of self-doubt, every failure complex, every paranoia of betrayal that had haunted him since he was a child in Georgia. He was officially a failure. His new family had abandoned him just like his old one. He took the ticket. He took the money. He flew back to Los Angeles, or perhaps he never even made it to the airport. The details are murky. The result is not. He went to a house in Laurel Canyon, and with the money, or with his own stash, he found his painkiller, the one truly reliable thing. He had left the only thing that could silence the noise of this final, total rejection. He was 29 years old. The 2024 McDonough biography reveals one last, secret, heartbreaking detail. One of his final acts was not of rage. It was not of defiance. It was a private phone call, a phone call to Neil Young. His last words, not to the public, not to his family, but to his brother, his gatekeeper. I'm sorry, Neil. The man whose armor was so thick, whose trauma response was so deep, that even as he was dying, his only instinct was to apologize for being unreliable. The kid from the duplex, apologizing for being a problem. The painkiller had won. The noise at last was silent. On November 18, 1972, Danny Whitten, the raw energy core, the garage genius, was dead at 29. The king was dead. The shockwave was immediate, but it was not loud. It was a deafening, sickening silence. For the world at large, it was barely a footnote. Another long-haired musician who had partied too hard. The name Danny Whitten, to most people, was just a name in the liner notes of a Neil Young record for Reprise, the record label. It was a practical problem. The result was blunt. Reprise dropped Crazy Horse. Of course they did. The energy core was gone. The band, the new family that Danny had built, was, for all intents and purposes, finished. But for one man, the silence was the loudest sound in the world. For Neil Young, this was not a footnote. It was an indictment. This was the man of order who had, in a single pragmatic act, unleashed a chaos that had resulted in his friend's death. The guilt was profound. It was total. And it was his. He had fired his friend, and now his friend was dead. He had given him $50, and now that $50 felt like Judas's silver, and he had received that final heartbreaking secret phone call. I'm sorry, Neil. Neil Young was and is a man of action. But how do you fix a ghost? How do you control a void? He did the only thing he knew how to do. He went to a studio. He picked up a guitar, and he became the ghost. If Danny Whitten's story had been a tragedy, Neil Young's next move was the epilogue. It was the painful, raw, and necessary wake he flew to Los Angeles. He gathered the broken, shattered remnants of his circle. He gathered the survivors of the new family that Danny had anchored, Billy Talbot and Ralph Molina. And in 1973, in a fog of tequila, grief, and rage, they went into a studio. This was not a recording session. This was a seance. They were not there to make a polished, perfect follow-up to the blockbuster country rock album, Harvest. They were there to mourn. They were there to scream. The result was the album Tonight's the Night. It is, to this day, one of the most raw, painful, unvarnished, and terrifyingly honest albums ever recorded. It is not a tribute to Danny Whitten. It is an autopsy. It is a drunken, weeping, angry, and chaotic exorcism. The album cover is a dark, blurry, haunting photograph of Neil Young, his face gaunt, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, looking not like a rock star, but like a ghost himself. The entire album's explicitly dedicated not just to Danny Whitten, but also to Bruce Berry, another friend and roadie who had overdosed. This was Neil Young's Painkiller album. And what did it sound like? It sounded like Danny Whitten. It was the raw energy, the chaos, the distorted sound that Danny had embodied, but now it was unhinged. It was the sound of the garage taken to its darkest, most logical conclusion. The music is sloppy. It's distorted. It's out of tune. Neil's voice doesn't just sing, it cracks. It wavers. It screams. The album's title track, which opens and closes the record, is a dirge. Neil sings about Bruce Berry. He was a working man. He used to load that gear. But he was, of course, singing about Danny. He was singing about the practical job, the survival world that had, in the end, reclaimed them both. This was Neil Young, the man of order, processing his guilt by creating chaos. He, Billy, and Ralph, the reliable family, had to become unreliable to process the loss of their anchor. They had to make the most unreliable album of their lives. When they turned the album into the record label, Reprise was horrified. This was the follow-up to Harvest? This noise? This drunken, depressing, raw, uncommercial mess? They refused to release it. It sat on a shelf for 2 years. Think about that, the final, perfect, tragic irony. Danny Whitten's own, pure, vulnerable ambition, the Loose album, had flopped because it was too raw, too real, too uncommercial. And now, Neil Young's tribute to him, the album that channeled his very essence, was also being rejected by the gatekeepers for the exact same reason. Tonight's the Night was finally released, unchanged, in 1975. It was, as expected, a commercial disaster upon release, but it was an artistic triumph. It was the sound of Neil Young's guilt. It was the sound of the raw energy that Danny had embodied. It was the only headstone that mattered. But the story of Danny Whitten's legacy doesn't end there. It splits into two cruelly ironic parallel paths. The first path is the path of the poet. While Neil Young was in his drunken seance, the world at large had forgotten Danny Whitten. They had forgotten the Loose album, but someone hadn't. In 1977, 5 years after Danny's death, a British superstar named Rod Stewart was at the peak of his fame. He was one of the biggest voices on the planet, and he was looking for a song. Somehow, he found that quiet, heartbreaking failed ballad from the failed 1971 Loose album. He found I Don't Want to Talk About It. He recorded it, and his version, it's beautiful. It's a gorgeous, soaring, string-drenched power ballad. Rod Stewart's voice, one of the greatest of all time, treats the lyric with a tender, romantic melancholy. But it is not a confession. It is not a suicide note. It is a ballad. It is the pain repackaged. It is the raw made cooked. It is the chaos given a perfect 3-act order. And the world adored it. Rod Stewart's version of I Don't Want to Talk About It was a monster hit. It shot to #1 in the UK. It became a global anthem. This is the ultimate and most heartbreaking Danny Whitten tragedy, his ambition, his purest, most vulnerable, most uncommercial piece of art, the failure that had in part driven him to his death. It became one of the most famous and beloved songs of the decade. Millions, perhaps billions, of people have slow danced to this song at their weddings. They have cried to this song after a breakup. They have fallen in love to this song, and almost none of them, none, know the name of the man who wrote it. Almost none of them know that its beautiful, simple, heartbreaking words were written by a lost genius from Georgia, a misfit kid, a man who couldn't talk about his pain, a man who was, at the very moment he was writing it, being consumed and killed by that very pain. It is the perfect, cruel, final irony, the poet whose voice was only heard after he was gone, sung by someone else. His ambition was finally totally validated, and he wasn't there to see it. But that is only one path of his legacy, the path of the poet. The other path, the path of the energy core, the path of the noise, was just as powerful for years. That raw, distorted, fuzzy sound that Danny had pioneered, the sound that Neil Young had channeled on Tonight's the Night, went underground. The 1980s were the opposite of Danny Whitten. It was an era of digital, clean, slick, polished, practical pop. The garage was closed. But in the dark, damp, survival landscape of the American underground, something was brewing. In the late 1980s and early 1990s in Seattle, Washington, a new generation of misfits was emerging. A new generation of kids from broken homes, kids who felt like outsiders, kids consumed by anxiety and self-doubt, a new generation in profound psychic pain. And what did their music sound like? It sounded like Danny Whitten. It was raw. It was distorted. It was fuzzy. It was built on simple, powerful, loping grooves. It was music that rejected technical proficiency for pure, raw feeling. It was the sound of ambition and pain all mixed up. When Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, a man who famously wrote about his own crippling, lifelong pain, plugged in his guitar, what came out? The raw energy of Danny Whitten. When Pearl Jam and Mudhoney and Soundgarden created the grunge movement, what were they doing? They were, whether they knew it or not, the children of Danny Whitten. They were the descendants of Crazy Horse. Neil Young, in this era, was rightfully crowned the godfather of grunge, and he was the order. He was the poet who gave it structure. The sound of grunge, the chaos, the noise, the raw energy. That was the ghost of Danny Whitten, his painkiller sound, the distorted noise he had created as a symptom of his trauma, had become the order for an entire new generation. His ambition, it turned out, hadn't just been to be a front man. It had been to invent a language of pain, and it had taken the world 20 years to learn how to speak it. And that is his legacy. It's a story that is, as of 2024, still being written. New reissues of the Crazy Horse albums, new unreleased tracks featuring Danny's playing are still emerging. The lost genius is at last being found. So how do we conclude a life this tragic, this complex? Danny Whitten's life is a cautionary tale. Yes, the needle and the damage done. A lost genius cautionary tale about drugs. That is the easy story. That is the survival story, the practical job story. The real story, the ambition story, is that Danny Whitten was a true original. He was a garage genius who did something profound. He figured out how to turn the sound of his trauma into art. That raw, distorted, fuzzy guitar tone wasn't a sound. It was a symptom. It was the sound of his parents fighting. It was the sound of his stepfather's rage. It was the sound of his own crippling schizophrenia-like anxiety. And his tragedy is not that he was traumatized. His tragedy is that he was born in a time and in a place that had no language for his trauma, no therapy, no help, no name for his pain. And so he found his own. He found a painkiller called heroin, and it worked until it didn't. And his tragedy is that his other trauma response, the one he built to survive his childhood, was his reliable bandmate armor. It was this armor, this desperate need to be seen as reliable, that made it psychologically impossible for him to ask for help. It made it impossible for him to admit that he was unreliable. It made it impossible for him to admit that he was sick. He was a man whose armor was so thick it suffocated him. He was a man who, in his final act, apologized for being a problem. His life is a judgment on a world that only celebrates raw energy, but refuses to look at the source of that raw, painful energy. He was a lost genius. But thanks to the echo of his work, in the mournful cries of Tonight's the Night, in the billion-dollar ballad he never got to hear, and in the fuzzy, distorted roar of an entire generation that followed him, he is at last no longer lost.